This video depicts topics of violence, murder, and death and is not suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Here's a statement by Minister Hussein on Genocide, Remembrance, Condemnation, and Prevention Month here in Canada. Today marks the beginning of Genocide, Remembrance, Condemnation, and Prevention Month. During this time, Canadians will take a moment to remember the victims of genocide, honor the courage and resilience of all survivors and their descendants, and reflect on how we can prevent future atrocities from occurring. Acts of genocide begin with targeting and dehumanizing groups of people. Current events remind us that we must always be vigilant and stand united against prejudice, hate, as well as all forms of racism and discrimination that can lead to the tragic loss of life. We have a duty as a country to reflect on the root causes of hate and discrimination that lead to these unspeakable acts of violence, and we must do our part to ensure that these acts never happen again. As Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion, I invite Canadians to remember the victims of genocide and to read and listen to the stories of survivors, many of whom have made Canada their home and contributed to shaping the country we know today. In these uncertain times, let us reaffirm our commitment to protecting the fundamental human rights and dignity of everyone in Canada and around the world. We owe it to the victims and survivors of these unfathomable acts and to the generations to come. The definition of genocide, as established by the United Nations in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide, is genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as 1. Killing members of the group, 2. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, 3. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, 4. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and 5. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This definition serves as the international legal standard for identifying and prosecuting instances of genocide. Here are 10 individuals who have played significant roles in the fight against genocide. Raphael Lemkin. Raphael Lemkin is a Polish Jewish lawyer who coined the term genocide and advocated for the establishment of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948. Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor, author, and Nobel Prize laureate who dedicated his life to raising awareness about the Holocaust and speaking out against genocide and human rights abuses around the world. Samantha Power. Samantha Power, a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and Pulitzer Prize winner, author who has been a prominent advocate for human rights and played a key role in shaping U.S. policy on genocide prevention. Paul Rusesabagina, is a Rwandan humanitarian who saved over 1,200 people during the 1994 Rwandan genocide by sheltering them in the hotel he managed, an act depicted in the film Hotel Rwanda. Gareth Evans, a former foreign minister of Australia and co founder of the International Crisis Group, Evan has been a leading advocate for the responsibility to protect R2P doctrine, which aims to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Louise Arbour, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and former Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, Arbour has been a tireless advocate for justice and accountability for genocide and human rights violations. Aung San Suu Kyi, despite controversial aspects of her political career, Suu Kyi has been a symbol of resistance against oppression, particularly in Myanmar, formerly Burma, where she faced persecution under military rule. She was an outspoken advocate against genocide and human rights abuses, although her response to the Rohingya crisis has been criticized. Benjamin Ferencz, a former Nuremberg trial prosecutor, Ferencz has dedicated his life to promoting international justice and the rule of law. He has been vocal advocate for the establishment of the Permanent International Criminal Court to prosecute genocide and other crimes against humanity. The Yazidi activists, women like Nadia Mourada and Limia Ay Bashar, have become prominent voices in advocating for justice and recognition of the Yazidi community, which has faced genocide at the hands of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Romeo Dallaire, a retired Canadian lieutenant general who commanded the UN peacekeeping mission during the Rwandan genocide, Dallaire has played a vocal advocate for genocide prevention and mental health support for veterans and survivors. These individuals have made significant contribution to raising awareness, advocating for justice, and preventing future genocides through their activism, scholarships, and leaderships. Obviously, they are not the only important individuals in prevention of genocide worldwide. Has Canada or Canadians been accused of genocide? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. Canada has faced accusation of genocide, particularly concerning its treatment of Indigenous peoples. Here are just some of the instances where Canada or Canadians have been accused of genocide. Residential schools. One of the most significant examples is the Canadian government's residential school system, which operated from the late 19th centuries until the 1990s. Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and communities and placed in these church run schools, where they were often subjected to abuse, neglect, and attempts to erase their Indigenous cultures and identities. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, TRC, has characterized these residential school systems as a form of cultural genocide. High rates of Indigenous incarceration and child welfare interventions. Canada's justice and child welfare system has disproportionately targeted Indigenous peoples, leading to high rates of incarceration and child apprehensions. Some critics argued that these policies contribute to the ongoing marginalization and disempowerment of indigenous communities, amounting to a form of systemic genocide. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG. Indigenous women and girls in Canada face disproportionately high rates of violence, including murder and disappearance. Advocates and human rights organizations have criticized the Canadian government's response to this crisis, alleging systematic failures in addressing the root causes and providing adequate protection and justice for Indigenous women and girls. Resource extraction and environmental degradation. Indigenous communities can often bear the brunt of environmental degradation and health risks associated with resource extraction projects such as mining, logging, and oil and gas development. Some critics argue that the Canadian government's support of these industries without adequate consultation or consent from affected Indigenous communities constitutes a form of environmental genocide. These accusations of genocide highlight deep seated issues of colonialism, racism, and systemic discrimination within Canadian society and government institutions. Recognizing and addressing these historical and ongoing injustices is essential for reconciliation and building a form of more just and equitable society. Preventing genocide requires collective effort at various levels, from grassroots activism to international diplomacy. While the average person may not have direct influence over global policies, there are several practical actions individuals can take to contribute to genocide prevention. First, educate yourself. Learn about the historical and current genocides, their root causes, and warning signs. Understanding the complexities of genocide is essential for effective prevention. Raise awareness. Use your voice to raise awareness about genocide and human rights abuses. Share information on social media, participate in discussions, and support organizations working on genocide prevention. Support genocide prevention organizations. Donate to or volunteer with organizations dedicated to genocide prevention, human rights, and peace building. These organizations often provide critical support to affected communities and advocate for policy changes. Advocate for policy change. Write to your elected representative, urging them to support policies and initiatives aimed at preventing genocide, such as funding for conflict prevention, peace building efforts, and support for international justice mechanisms. Combat hate speech and discrimination. Speak out against hate speech, discrimination, and intolerance in your community. Promote inclusivity, empathy, and understanding across cultural and ethnic lines. Support victims and survivors. Show solidarity with victims and survivors of genocide by listening to their stories, amplifying their voices, and supporting initiatives that provide assistance and healing. Promote conflict resolution and dialogue. Encourage peaceful dialogue and conflict resolution in your community and beyond. Foster understanding and reconciliation between groups in conflict. Monitor media and social media. Be vigilant about misinformation, propaganda, and incitement to violence in media and social platforms. challenge false narratives, and promote accurate reporting. Participate in peace building initiatives. Engage in local peace building efforts, dialogue forums, and reconciliation initiatives. Building relationships and trust across divides can help prevent conflicts from escalating into violence. Be an active bystander. If you witness discrimination or harassment, intervene safely and supportively. Speak up against injustice and advocate for those who may be at risk. Support refugees and internally displaced persons. Advocate for policies that protect and support refugees and internally displaced persons fleeing conflicts and persecution. Offer assistance and solidarity to displaced individuals and families in your community. Finally, hold perpetrators accountable. Support efforts to hold perpetrators of genocide and mass atrocities accountable through national and international justice mechanisms. Demand justice for victims and survivors. While individual actions may seem small, collectively they can contribute to building a more peaceful and just world where genocide becomes less likely to occur.